The mountain man paid a pregnant widow to be his cook, but found a woman who taught him the meaning of grace. Garrick Hale pulled his fur-lined hood tighter and gripped the handle of his shovel. He had been alone in the mountains for almost 10 years, carving his life out of the frozen rock and thin air. Garrick was known across the mining colonies as a man who got things done, but at a cost. He spoke little, smiled less, and trusted almost no one. In the remote outpost where he lived, this had never been a problem, but today was different. Garrick stood at the edge of his cabin's small clearing, staring at the figure trudging through the snow toward him. She moved slowly but steadily, her steps careful. Even from a distance, he could see the outline of her condition. She was pregnant, her form heavy under her worn coat, but her posture was upright, unbowed by exhaustion or fear. Garrick studied her for a long moment. He didn't usually hire help. He didn't like relying on anyone. Yet for reasons he didn't want to admit even to himself, he had sent a message weeks ago asking for a cook, someone who could prepare meals, manage his small hydroponic garden, and keep his outpost in order while he focused on the mines. Now she was here. "Marave," he called, his voice rough like gravel. The woman paused and lifted her head. Her eyes were calm and steady, not filled with fear, not filled with pleading, just observant. "Garrick Hale," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I was told this was the place." Garrick nodded once. "It is. Come inside. It's colder out here than it looks." Mara moved closer, stepping carefully over the icy ground. She carried a small pack on her back, and Garrick noticed the way she balanced it, as though she had been trained to manage heavy loads even while exhausted. He didn't ask where she had traveled from. It didn't matter. He only cared that she was here and that she could do the job. Inside the cabin, the heat from the small stove brushed against them like a warm hand. Garrick had already prepared a simple bed and cleared a space for her belongings. Mara set her pack down gently and began unpacking, revealing neatly folded clothes, a few personal tools, and a small pouch of dried herbs. Garrick watched silently, noting her careful movements. Everything she did was measured, efficient, and calm. "I'll start with supper," she said, moving toward the stove. "Do you eat alone, or should I set another place?" "Alone," Garrick said, his tone blunt. "But you'll eat too, don't starve yourself." Mara didn't argue. She set to work, lighting the stove, boiling water, and preparing a simple meal of roasted root vegetables and rehydrated grains. The aroma filled the cabin, a small but important comfort in the cold, lonely outpost. Garrick sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea, watching her. "You work fast," he said finally, almost against his will. Mara glanced at him, a small smile touching her lips. "I've learned it's easier to keep moving than to fall behind." Garrick grunted. He didn't usually talk much, and he didn't usually compliment anyone. But there was something about her, something he couldn't name, that made him listen. As they ate in quiet, Garrick found himself noticing little things. The way she hummed a soft tune while stirring the food. The careful way she arranged the plates and cleaned as she went. The patience in her movements, even when the snow outside rattled against the walls like a drum. It was a kind of grace he had never seen before. After the meal, Mara cleaned up without needing to be asked. Garrick leaned back in his chair, sipping tea, thinking about how strange it felt to have someone else in his cabin. He had spent so many years alone that even the presence of another human was unsettling. "You'll need to see the hydroponics," Garrick said finally. "The plants aren't doing well. I can't keep them alive and mine at the same time." "I can help," Mara said. "I have experience with gardens and small ecosystems. We can try to stabilize them together." Garrick raised an eyebrow. He had never let anyone touch his systems before. But something in Mara's calm, quiet confidence made him pause. Perhaps it was her demeanor, or perhaps it was the simple fact that she was willing to work alongside him rather than under him. "Tomorrow," he said gruffly, "we'll see what you can do." The night settled over the mountains, deep and dark. Garrick found sleep difficult. He was not used to having someone else in his cabin, and yet he could not deny the comfort Mara's presence brought. She moved quietly, even in her rest, as though aware of the dangers of this harsh land and the fragile life she carried. The next morning, a blizzard began without warning. Snow whipped around the cabin, making it difficult to see even a few meters ahead. Garrick went to check the roof and the energy lines leading to the outpost's main generator. It was a delicate task, and one mistake could mean hours without heat, a fatal risk in the freezing cold. Mara appeared at the door, carrying a bundle of supplies. "I thought you might need an extra pair of hands," she said calmly, her eyes scanning the storm. Garrick blinked. He wasn't used to anyone volunteering, let alone someone he barely knew. "You don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted gently. "If the generator fails, it will be too late to regret staying out of this." Together, they navigated the storm. Mara handed tools, adjusted cables, and even suggested changes to the energy circuits that Garrick hadn't thought of. For the first time in years, he realized that perhaps another human could see what he could not. Her knowledge, her calm approach, and her attention to detail saved them both from a near disaster. When they returned to the cabin, soaked and exhausted, Garrick looked at her differently. She was not just a cook. She was someone who could endure, who could think clearly under pressure, and who could act with kindness even in the harshest conditions. "I underestimated you," he admitted quietly, surprising himself. Mara smiled faintly. "You're not the first person to do that, but sometimes people only learn when they need to." Garrick nodded, looking out at the mountains. For a moment, he thought about the years he had spent alone, the pride he had clung to, and the walls he had built around his life. Mara's presence was beginning to show him a new way, one where strength was not just in surviving but in understanding and supporting others. The storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from a feeling Garrick had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. Respect, perhaps, or maybe something closer to hope. As night fell again, Garrick watched Mara as she prepared the next meal, her movements calm and deliberate. He realized he would need to learn more from her, not just about cooking or plants, but about living, about grace, about seeing value in life beyond the solitary achievements he had clung to for so long. The mountains were harsh. The wind was relentless. Life on Erindor Prime was unforgiving. But for the first time in years, Garrick Hale felt that perhaps, with Mara Vey here, survival could mean more than just enduring, it could mean living. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, Garrick did not yet know that this simple, quiet woman would teach him lessons that went far beyond food, warmth, and survival. She would teach him the meaning of grace. The morning sun barely pierced the thick blanket of clouds over Erindor Prime. Snow still clung to the jagged peaks, and the wind carried a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the mountains. Inside the cabin, Garrick Hale sat at the table, sipping his tea and watching Mara move around with quiet purpose. Today would be different. He had seen her skill in the storm yesterday, but he did not yet fully understand the depth of her resourcefulness. Garrick had always relied on brute force and solitary work. Problems, to him, were things to fix with strength, patience, and stubbornness. Mara, however, approached each challenge with patience, observation, and creativity, a combination Garrick had never truly considered. "Let's check the hydroponics," Mara said, tying her hair back and carefully stepping over the small pipes that crisscrossed the cabin's floor. "Some of the nutrient levels are off, and the temperature control fluctuates. It's why the plants aren't growing well." Garrick grunted. "I tried adjusting it yesterday. Nothing worked." Mara shook her head slightly. "I don't mean to replace your work. I just want to see if we can make small changes that add up." He followed her to the hydroponic area, watching her inspect each plant, each water pump, and each tube. She pressed a small scanner to the roots of a plant, read the results, and made notes on a small tablet she had brought with her. Garrick was struck by the careful attention she gave to each detail. "See," she said, pointing at a small cluster of plants, "these are not getting enough light because the reflector was tilted yesterday. If we adjust this and change the nutrient mix slightly, the growth will improve in a week." Garrick frowned. He had never measured so carefully or noticed such small details. "A week?" he asked. Mara smiled faintly. "A week is enough if you do it correctly. Rushing will only waste energy and resources." The day wore on, and Garrick found himself working alongside her. He cleaned pipes, adjusted valves, and even carefully mixed nutrients under her guidance. It was the first time in years that he felt he was learning something from someone else, not just teaching them. During a brief break, Mara prepared a small meal, a mix of dried vegetables, grains, and fresh herbs. She handed him a bowl, and Garrick almost reluctantly accepted it. "You don't have to cook for me," he said gruffly, though he secretly appreciated the warmth and flavor of her food. "I want to," she said, setting her bowl down. "Food keeps you alive, yes, but it also reminds you why you are fighting to survive. Comfort matters." Garrick looked at her, noticing for the first time how her presence seemed to bring calm to the cabin. It was not just her skills, it was her way of seeing the world. She valued life, even in small things, and it challenged Garrick's long-held belief that survival was only about strength and endurance. As afternoon approached, a soft alarm sounded from the outpost's energy monitor. Garrick's brow furrowed. "The generator's output is dropping," he said, rushing to the control panel. "That shouldn't be happening." Mara moved beside him, her voice calm. "Let's check the connections first. Sometimes the cold affects the conduits before the system registers it." Together, they followed the power lines to the main generator. Garrick expected to see a broken component, something simple to fix with brute force. Instead, Mara carefully examined each joint, tested circuits, and adjusted settings with precision. When she spoke, Garrick listened, surprised at how methodical her approach was. "You can't force these systems," Mara said gently. "They need patience, observation, and understanding. Strength only gets you so far." Garrick frowned, thinking about all the years he had tried to brute force problems. He had always prided himself on endurance, on action, on sheer will. Mara was teaching him that endurance alone was not enough. Human ingenuity, creativity, and calm observation were equally vital. By the evening, the generator was stable again, and the cabin was warm. Garrick sat on his chair, exhausted but thoughtful. Mara moved around the cabin, feeding the plants and cleaning the small kitchen. "You know," he said finally, "I never thought of it this way. I always believed survival was about being tougher than everything else." Mara paused, looking at him with quiet understanding. "Toughness helps," she said, "but alone it is not enough. We live because we adapt, because we care, and because we see value in things beyond ourselves. That's what makes humans human." Garrick was silent, considering her words. He had never had anyone explain life like this to him. Not his mentors, not his fellow miners, not even his late father. Mara was teaching him lessons he didn't know he needed. As night fell, the wind grew stronger. Snow rattled against the cabin's walls. Garrick expected the usual anxiety that came with storms, but Mara's calm presence seemed to shield him from it. She moved quietly, checking supplies, adjusting heaters, and even humming a soft tune that reminded him of warmth and safety. "You don't fear the storm?" Garrick asked, watching her work. "I respect it," Mara said simply. "Fear makes you careless. Respect keeps you alive." Garrick nodded slowly. He had lived through countless storms, always relying on his strength and stubbornness. But he had never considered that calm observation, preparation, and grace under pressure could be more powerful than brute force. The next morning, Garrick awoke to find Mara already tending the garden. He watched her work for a few moments, then silently joined her. Together, they adjusted lights, added nutrients, and reinforced the plant supports. Garrick realized he was learning not just about hydroponics but about patience, about noticing small details, about working with someone instead of against the world alone. During a break, Mara sat beside him, sipping water from a small flask. "Do you ever think about why you work so hard, Garrick?" she asked. He frowned. "To survive, to live another day. What else is there?" Mara smiled softly. "To survive is important, yes. But to live, to truly live, is more than surviving. It's about making a difference, helping others, and finding meaning in small acts of care. Even something as simple as a plant growing or a meal shared. It matters." Garrick considered this. For years, he had measured his life in days survived, in mountains mined, in challenges overcome alone. Mara was showing him a new way, one where life was measured not just by endurance but by kindness, grace, and understanding. Their work continued through the day. Garrick found himself laughing quietly at Mara's dry humor, listening intently when she explained a clever adjustment to the generator, and even offering suggestions that she would thoughtfully consider. It was the first time he had felt part of something larger than himself, yet he did not want to admit it. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the storm clouds began to break, revealing a faint glow of evening light. Garrick looked out the cabin window and realized that, for the first time in years, the mountains no longer seemed entirely hostile. There was beauty here, danger, yes, but also life. And now he was beginning to see the value of grace, patience, and human ingenuity. Mara prepared the evening meal, a simple stew with fresh herbs from the cabin garden. She set a bowl in front of him, and for a moment they ate in silence. Garrick noticed that the warmth from the food and the cabin was different from any fire he had felt in years. It was the warmth of shared effort, shared survival, and quiet understanding. "You're teaching me more than I thought you would," Garrick admitted quietly. Mara looked at him, eyes calm and gentle. "And you are listening even if you don't realize it. That is the first step." Garrick sipped his stew, thinking about the storm, the plants, the generator, and the lessons of the day. He realized that survival was not just about muscles, tools, or stubbornness. It was about observation, patience, cooperation, and grace, the ability to act with wisdom even in the face of danger. For the first time in years, Garrick felt a strange sense of hope. He did not yet understand how much Mara would change his life, but he felt that the lessons she was teaching him were only the beginning. As night fell completely and the mountains grew quiet, Garrick sat by the fire, watching the flickering flames. The wind outside continued to howl, but inside there was warmth, safety, and a small but important realization. Survival was only part of life. Living and living with grace was something far greater. And Garrick Hale, the mountain man who had always relied on his own strength, began to understand that perhaps the true meaning of survival was learning from others, trusting, and letting small acts of grace guide his way. The wind on Erindor Prime had grown colder over the past 2 days, stronger than anything Garrick Hale had seen in years. Snow whipped across the jagged peaks, and the clouds above had thickened into a dark, heavy blanket. The outpost creaked and groaned under the force of the storm, and Garrick could feel the tension in the air, a warning that this was not a normal winter blizzard. He stood near the cabin window, staring at the swirling white beyond, his jaw tight. Alone, he would have relied on brute force and stubbornness to keep the outpost running. But now Mara was there, and her calm, steady presence reminded him that survival required more than muscle. It required intelligence, preparation, and grace. "Garrick," Mara's voice called from the hydroponics room, "the main generator is dropping again. We need to act before the heat fails." He hurried over, seeing the readouts blinking red. The generator's output was unstable, fluctuating dangerously in the face of the storm. This was serious. Without power, the cabin's heating and life support systems would fail in hours, and the temperature outside was already deadly. "I'll check the lines," Garrick said, grabbing his toolkit. "I'll monitor the generator," Mara replied. "We need to do this together." Garrick froze for a moment. Alone, he could have handled this, or so he thought. But Mara's calm confidence made him realize that working together was smarter than acting alone. For the first time, he accepted help without hesitation. Outside, the snow had turned into a blinding white sheet. Visibility was almost zero, and the wind threatened to knock him off his feet. Garrick's breath came in short bursts as he made his way to the main power lines, Mara's voice shouting instructions from the cabin. "Check the northern conduit. The pressure is dropping there," she said. Garrick climbed to the conduit, his gloved hands gripping icy metal. The storm battered him, and snow piled quickly around the lines. He worked fast but carefully, testing connections, tightening bolts, and rerouting power. Mara's calm voice guided him, correcting mistakes before they became disasters. Hours passed. Each time Garrick fixed a line, another warning flashed on the control panel. It was exhausting, but Mara stayed calm. She checked circuits, adjusted the generator's internal settings, and predicted how the storm would affect the power flow. Every time Garrick wanted to rush a repair, she stopped him. "Patience," she said. "We do it right or it fails." Finally, a sudden jolt shook the cabin. The lights flickered, and a section of the hydroponic system froze. Garrick cursed under his breath. The storm was more powerful than anything he had anticipated. Snow had drifted against the cabin, blocking ventilation and adding weight to the roof. One mistake now could cost them everything. Mara's eyes were calm as she assessed the situation. "The storm is stronger than predicted. We need to stabilize the main generator and the secondary life support systems simultaneously. I'll handle the secondary while you work on the primary." Garrick nodded. He was exhausted, cold, and tense, but Mara's quiet determination gave him focus. Together, they moved with precision. Garrick climbed along the frozen lines while Mara adjusted power settings and rerouted energy to backup systems. They worked wordlessly, letting action speak instead of conversation. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the outpost. A support beam near the main generator roof had snapped under the weight of the snow. Garrick froze, his heart hammering. If the beam fell, it could crush the generator, ending all power. He looked at Mara. She was calm, scanning the situation, already calculating a solution. "Move," she shouted. "Quickly, hold the support until I stabilize the generator." Without hesitation, Garrick braced the beam with a metal bar while Mara adjusted the generator's output to reduce stress on the structure. The cabin shook as the wind tore at the walls, but their combined effort held the beam steady. For a moment, neither spoke. They just worked, moving in sync, responding to the storm and each other. When the generator finally stabilized and the emergency systems kicked in, Garrick collapsed onto the floor, chest heaving. Mara knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're not done yet," she said softly, "but we've bought ourselves time." Garrick nodded, breathing deeply. He had survived countless storms alone, but this one had been different. Mara's guidance, her calm intelligence, and her willingness to act without fear had saved them both. For the first time, he realized that strength alone was not enough. Hours later, the storm raged on, but the cabin was warm, the lights steady, and the hydroponic system partially stabilized. Garrick sat at the table, sipping hot tea, feeling a strange sense of humility. Mara moved around the cabin, feeding plants, checking circuits, and preparing a simple meal. "You handled yourself well," she said, handing him a bowl of stew. "Even with the storm, you stayed focused." Garrick shook his head. "I couldn't have done it without you. I've always believed I had to rely on myself. I see now that I was wrong." Mara smiled faintly. "It's not weakness to accept help. It's understanding. True strength is knowing when to act alone and when to work with others." For the first time in his life, Garrick understood what she meant. He had survived because he was strong, yes, but he had truly lived because he had learned to trust, to observe, and to act with patience and grace. The next morning, the storm began to subside. Snow still drifted, but the wind had lost some of its bite. Garrick and Mara worked together to repair the remaining damage to the generator and hydroponics. As they labored, Garrick realized that he was learning more than technical skills. He was learning about life, patience, and trust. "Do you ever worry?" Garrick asked as he adjusted a frozen pipe. Mara looked at him, eyes thoughtful. "Of course, worry is natural. But fear can make you careless. I worry, yes, but I focus on what I can control and act calmly. That's how we survive and how we live." Garrick nodded slowly. He had spent years facing danger alone, relying on fear and instinct. Mara's way was different. It required patience, planning, and grace, and he realized for the first time that it was far more powerful than sheer force. By evening, the cabin was fully operational again. The generator hummed steadily, the plants were stable, and the emergency systems were back in control. Garrick sat near the fire, watching Mara prepare a simple meal. She moved with calm precision, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm outside. "You know," Garrick said quietly, "I never thought survival could feel like this." Mara glanced at him. "Like what?" "Like hope," he admitted. "Like there's more to life than just staying alive. You've taught me that." Mara smiled softly. "I haven't taught you anything. You've learned it yourself. You just needed someone to show you that it's possible." Garrick watched her quietly. He had hired her to cook, to help maintain his cabin, but he realized now that she had given him something far greater. A vision of life where human ingenuity, cooperation, and grace were more important than strength alone. That night, as the storm finally passed, Garrick lay awake by the fire, listening to the quiet hum of the generator and the soft breathing of Mara as she slept. The mountains outside were still harsh and unforgiving, but inside the cabin he felt a strange warmth, one born not from fire or shelter, but from trust, understanding, and the lessons of grace he had begun to learn. For the first time, Garrick Hale understood that life on Urindor Prime was not just about surviving storms. It was about learning, adapting, and valuing the strength found in others. And Mara, the quiet, determined woman he had hired to cook, was teaching him that survival without grace was empty, but survival with grace could be extraordinary. The crisis had passed, but Garrick knew that this was only the beginning. The mountains were still waiting, challenges still lay ahead, and the lessons Mara had shown him would be tested again. But he felt ready to face the next storm, not alone, but with someone who had shown him that true strength was more than muscle, more than stubbornness. It was grace. And for the first time, Garrick Hale believed he could truly live, not just survive. The storm had passed, leaving a fragile calm over the mountains of Urindor Prime. Snow sparkled like tiny crystals in the weak morning sunlight, and the wind that had once howled violently now whispered through the jagged peaks. Garrick Hale stepped outside his cabin, feeling the crunch of snow beneath his boots. For the first time in years, he breathed deeply, aware of the stillness and beauty around him. Mara Vey was already at the garden, her hands gently adjusting the hydroponic systems, checking each plant as if she were tending to a living creature rather than fragile technology. Her movements were calm, precise, and graceful, qualities Garrick had begun to admire more than he would ever admit. "You work quickly," he said, coming closer, "but you never rush." Mara looked at him and smiled softly. "Rushing leads to mistakes. Life, even in its simplest forms, needs patience." Garrick nodded, realizing that he had never thought of life this way. He had spent years relying on speed, strength, and stubborn endurance. Mara had shown him that true survival, the kind that allowed humans not just to endure but to thrive, required patience, observation, and careful attention to others. The morning passed with quiet work. They repaired minor damage from the storm, checked the generator, and adjusted the hydroponics to ensure the plants would recover fully. Garrick found himself observing Mara, not just her skill, but her thoughtfulness. Every adjustment she made was deliberate, every choice considered. It was as if she approached the world with respect rather than defiance. At midday, Mara prepared a simple meal and set it on the table outside the cabin. The cold air nipped at Garrick's cheeks, but the warmth of the food and the quiet beauty of the sunlit snow made him feel peaceful. "You never asked me why I do what I do," Mara said, breaking the silence as she stirred a small pot of soup. Garrick frowned. "Why does it matter?" Mara smiled faintly. "Because everything we do matters, not just surviving but how we treat others while we live. Even small actions, a meal prepared carefully, a plant nurtured, a problem solved calmly carry meaning. That's what keeps life from being empty." Garrick was silent, chewing thoughtfully. Her words were simple, but they struck him deeply. He had always lived for himself, surviving, mining, enduring. He had never considered the impact of his actions beyond his own life. Mara's philosophy was new to him. It was not about strength or survival alone. It was about care, patience, and grace. As afternoon approached, Garrick decided to test this new understanding. He climbed to the observation deck of the cabin, where the wind still cut sharply, and watched the mountains. Mara joined him quietly, standing beside him without comment. "Do you ever think about the people you might have left behind?" she asked, her voice soft. Garrick frowned. "I don't have anyone left." Mara's gaze did not waver. "We all have people, Garrick. Even the mountains teach us that. The way we act, the way we help, the way we survive, it affects others. Grace is noticing that." He looked at her, unsure what to say. He had survived alone for years, priding himself on being self-sufficient. But Mara's words made him realize that self-sufficiency without consideration for others was incomplete. He had survived storms, frozen nights, and dangerous climbs, but he had never truly lived. The evening brought another test. A minor avalanche swept down from the peaks, threatening the lower sections of the outpost. The snow was heavy, dangerous, and fast-moving. Garrick grabbed his tools, ready to react with his usual brute force approach, but Mara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Wait," she said. "Rushing will only make it worse. We need a plan." He paused, surprised by the calm in her voice. He had always acted first, thinking later. Now he listened. Together, they assessed the avalanche path and devised a simple plan. Temporary barriers using heavy debris, diversion of energy lines, and safe shelters for the most fragile systems. Mara coordinated the work, guiding Garrick with quiet authority. As they implemented the plan, Garrick realized something he had never felt before: trust. He trusted Mara completely, not just to keep herself safe, but to keep the outpost, the systems, and even him safe. And in that trust, he discovered a new kind of strength, one that did not come from muscle or stubbornness, but from unity, patience, and wisdom. When the avalanche subsided, the outpost was intact. The hydroponics and generator were safe, and the small cabin had suffered only minor damage. Garrick breathed a heavy sigh, feeling exhaustion mixed with a profound sense of gratitude. "You see," Mara said softly, brushing snow from her coat, "survival is not just about enduring danger. It's about thinking, caring, and acting with awareness. That's grace." Garrick nodded slowly. "I think I'm beginning to understand," he admitted. "It's different from what I thought strength meant," Mara smiled. "It's not easy to understand, especially for someone used to relying on themselves, but every day gives you a chance to practice." That night, Garrick found himself thinking not about the mountains or the outpost, but about Mara and the lessons she was teaching. He realized that grace was not a single act, it was a way of living. It was patience in chaos, calm in danger, and care for others even when it required effort. And Mara embodied it completely. Days passed, and life at the outpost slowly returned to normal. Garrick worked alongside Mara, not just as a helper but as a learner. He repaired equipment, managed the hydroponics, and even prepared small meals under Mara's guidance. Each task became an opportunity to practice patience, precision, and thoughtfulness. One afternoon, Mara sat beside him as he adjusted a nutrient system. "You've come a long way," she said gently. "You're learning to see what matters, not just what survives." Garrick looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I never thought I could care this much about anything besides myself," he admitted. "But I do. And it feels good," Mara nodded. "That's the first step toward grace. Caring gives life meaning, even in harsh places like these mountains." The next challenge came quietly but unexpectedly. A section of the hydroponic system began leaking, threatening to ruin the delicate plants that Mara had nurtured. Garrick rushed to fix it, panic rising in his chest, but Mara stopped him. "Slow down," she said calmly. "We need to assess the situation, plan our steps, and work carefully. Panic will only make it worse." He took a deep breath and followed her instructions. Together, they repaired the leak with minimal damage. Garrick realized again that strength alone, rushing, forcing, acting without thought, would have ruined everything. Mara's guidance, her calm patience, and her understanding of cause and effect had saved the day. By evening, Garrick felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had survived storms, avalanches, and freezing nights, but he had never felt truly alive until he began learning from Mara. She had taught him that survival was not enough, that true life required grace, patience, and care. That night he sat by the fire, watching Mara prepare a simple dinner. The mountains outside were silent, the sky clear, and the cabin warm. Garrick thought about the lessons of the past days: trust, patience, careful planning, and human connection. These were the things that truly mattered. "You've changed," Mara said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Garrick looked at her, feeling something he had never allowed himself to feel before: humility. "Maybe," he admitted. "I'm learning." "Good," Mara said softly. "Learning is the first step. Applying what you learn, that is grace." As the fire crackled, Garrick Hale realized something profound. Mara had not just saved the outpost or guided him through storms. She had shown him a way to live, to see the value in small acts, to trust, to care, and to act with wisdom and patience. He had been a mountain man, strong and solitary, surviving day by day. But now he was beginning to understand that grace, more than strength, made life meaningful. The mountains would remain harsh and unforgiving. Storms would come again. Challenges would arise, but Garrick felt ready. Ready not just to survive, but to live. Guided by the lessons Mara had taught him, strengthened by her patience, and inspired by the grace she embodied. And as he closed his eyes that night, he knew that life on Urindor Prime would never be the same, not because the mountains had changed, but because he had. The dawn on Urindor Prime was quiet and beautiful. The storm that had ravaged the mountains days before had passed completely, leaving fresh snow sparkling in the early sunlight. Garrick Hale stepped outside his cabin, the crisp air filling his lungs. The mountains were still jagged, still dangerous, but there was a calm in the world that felt almost magical. He looked toward the hydroponic garden, where Mara Vey was already tending the plants. Her movements were gentle, precise, and deliberate as always. She hummed softly, a tune that had become familiar to Garrick over the past weeks, a song of calm and hope in a harsh world. "Good morning," he called, his voice stronger and steadier than it had been during the storm. Mara turned, smiling. "Morning. Did you sleep well?" Garrick nodded. "Better than I have in years." The truth was, he had not only slept well, but he had also begun to feel something he had not felt in a long time: hope. Hope that life in these mountains could mean more than survival, that he could live, not just endure. That people mattered and grace could change lives. Today, however, was not a day for rest. The storm had caused minor damage to the outpost's energy lines and hydroponics, and Garrick and Mara had work to do. But unlike before, Garrick approached the tasks with calm and confidence, not fear and frustration. He had learned from Mara that patience and planning could accomplish far more than frantic effort. They worked together in perfect coordination. Garrick checked the power conduits, ensuring no ice blocked the flow of energy. Mara repaired minor leaks in the hydroponics, her hands steady despite the cold. Occasionally, Garrick would make a suggestion and Mara would consider it, nodding with approval. It was a true partnership, one built on respect, trust, and shared understanding. As they worked, Garrick found himself thinking about how much he had changed. Weeks ago, he would have handled these repairs alone, relying on brute strength and stubbornness. Now he realized that strength was meaningless without awareness, patience, and care. Mara had taught him that true power lay not in isolation, but in cooperation and grace. Around midday, Mara paused to rest and handed Garrick a small cup of hot tea. "You've come a long way," she said softly. Garrick took the cup and nodded. "I've learned from the best," he admitted. For the first time, he felt comfortable acknowledging the truth. Mara had not just guided him through survival, she had taught him how to live. The day passed with steady work, and by late afternoon the outpost was fully repaired. The generator hummed steadily, the hydroponics were flourishing, and the cabin stood strong against the lingering cold winds. Garrick and Mara stood together outside, admiring their efforts. "You know," Garrick said quietly, "I never thought life could feel like this, meaningful." Mara smiled, brushing snow from her coat. "Meaning is everywhere if you take the time to see it. Every small act, every choice carries weight. That's the beauty of grace." Garrick nodded, understanding finally dawning on him. The storms, the hardships, the loneliness, they had all taught him survival. But Mara had shown him something greater. That life was not only about enduring, it was about caring, about trust, about lifting others along the way. That evening, a quiet tension filled the cabin. Mara rested, her hands on her growing belly, while Garrick prepared a simple meal. The work had been hard, but it had also been rewarding. He glanced at Mara, noticing how her presence filled the cabin with calm and warmth. He realized that the lessons she had given him went far beyond mechanics, plants, or meals. They were lessons about life itself. A few weeks later, the time came. Mara went into labor and Garrick stood beside her, steady and calm, recalling all he had learned. The outpost was prepared, the emergency systems ready, and Garrick's hands, once only capable of brute work, were now steady with care and patience. "Are you ready?" Mara asked, her voice calm despite the pain. Garrick nodded. "I'm here. We'll do this together." The labor was long, testing both of them, but Garrick remembered Mara's words about patience and observation. He monitored her comfort, adjusted heat, and ensured every tool and supply was ready. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and crying, Garrick felt a joy he had never known. He held the tiny infant carefully, feeling the warmth, the fragility, and the promise of new life. Mara smiled, exhausted but radiant. "We did it," she whispered. Garrick looked at her, feeling a profound gratitude. "No," he said softly, "you did it. You taught me everything I needed to know, I just helped." The birth marked a turning point. Garrick's life, once defined by solitude and survival, now had meaning beyond himself. He understood that human strength was not just about enduring harsh mountains or storms. It was about protecting, nurturing, and valuing life. Mara had taught him that, and now he carried the lesson in his heart. The following days were filled with quiet joy. Garrick learned to care for the infant, applying the patience and observation Mara had shown him. He repaired the cabin and the hydroponics, but now he did so with awareness of life beyond his own needs. The outpost felt alive in a way it never had before, filled with warmth, laughter, and hope. One morning, Garrick and Mara walked to the observation deck together, the baby cradled safely in her arms. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, harsh and beautiful as always. Garrick realized that the storms would continue, challenges would arise, and life on Erendor Prime would never be easy. But he also understood that with grace, patience, and human ingenuity, even the harshest world could feel like home. "You've changed," Mara said, smiling. Garrick nodded. "And so have you," he replied. "I don't just survive anymore, I live." Mara placed a hand on his arm. "That's the greatest lesson of all. Strength alone is not enough. Life is about care, trust, and grace, and now you understand that." For Garrick, the lesson was complete. The mountain man who had once relied solely on his own strength had discovered something greater, that human resilience, empathy, and patience were the true measure of survival. And with Mara and their child, he finally knew what it meant to live fully, with purpose and meaning. The sun rose higher over the mountains, reflecting off the pristine snow. Garrick held the baby carefully, looking at Mara with gratitude and admiration. He had been taught, guided, and inspired. He had learned to face storms not just with brute strength, but with patience, careful observation, and grace. And as he looked at the mountains stretching endlessly before him, Garrick felt a profound sense of peace. The hardships of the past had shaped him, but the lessons Mara had given him had transformed him. Life on Erindor Prime was still harsh, still dangerous, but it was also beautiful. And together, they would thrive, not just survive. The mountains, once symbols of isolation and struggle, now felt like a canvas of opportunity and hope. Garrick Hale, the mountain man who had once faced the world alone, had found life, love, and meaning. He had learned that the greatest strength was not endurance or solitude, it was grace, and the courage to live with it every day. And as the wind whispered gently through the peaks, Garrick held his child and looked at Mara. He smiled, finally understanding that true survival was not measured by how long one lived, but by the care, trust, and grace one shared with others. The new dawn had come, not just in the mountains but in their hearts.